Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
It's great to be here.
Today, we're tackling a massive topic. And I don't just mean massive in terms of historical scope, though it is. I mean, it's massive in what it suggests about, the very political ground we're all standing on.
It's one of those books that really gets under the hood.
Exactly. We're looking at a system that might just explain a feeling I think a lot of people have. No matter where they are on the political spectrum, it's that feeling that your vote doesn't really change the direction of the country.
That the real levers of power are somewhere else, disconnected.
Yes, that feeling. And this book suggests that's not just a feeling, it might be a feature of the design. So the systemic question we're asking is this: how do political and economic elites build durable governance systems that constrain the power of democratic majorities while, and this is the key part, maintaining the outward appearance of a functioning democracy?
That phrase, outward appearance, is so crucial. Because we aren't talking about a military coup. There are no tanks on the streets. The Constitution isn't, publicly shredded on TV.
No, it's something much quieter.
Much more subtle. More boring, in a way. And that's what makes it so effective. We're going to be analyzing constitutional design, institutional capture, and what the author calls the engineering of minority rule.
And let's just be really clear about the stakes before we dive in. This isn't about, say, who wins the next election. This isn't a Democrat versus Republican thing.
Not at its core, no. I mean, if you win an election, you get power for 2 years, maybe 4, maybe 8. But eventually the pendulum swings back.
Right.
What we're talking about today is a project designed to stop the pendulum from swinging. It's about changing the rules of how elections work, or what the government is even allowed to do, or how the courts interpret the law. If you can change the rules, you don't need to win every election. You can hold power for generations.
So our mission today, just to frame it for everyone, is to look at the patterns and structures that are described in our source material. We're not here to offer political prescriptions. We're not telling you who to vote for.
No, we're here to analyze the mechanics of a specific ideology that, according to the book, sought to literally put democracy in chains.
And the book that's guiding us through this is Democracy in Chains: The Deep History of the Radical Right's Stealth Plan for America by Nancy MacLean.
A very, very significant text. It made huge waves when it came out because it connected a lot of dots that I think most people didn't even know were on the same page.
So let's start there with the author, Nancy MacLean. Her background is as a historian, right? American political development, labor movements, that sort of thing.
Correct. And the origin story of this book is honestly fascinating because she didn't set out to find some grand hidden plan. It was almost an accident.
She wasn't like a conspiracy hunter.
Not at all. She was doing what sounds like very specific, maybe even a little dry academic research on the history of school vouchers in Virginia.
Okay.
So she's digging through state archives, looking at the huge fights over school desegregation back in the 1950s and 60s. And she just keeps seeing the same name pop up again and again. An autonomist named James Buchanan.
A name that, I'll be honest, was completely new to me before this book. And I try to stay pretty informed.
I think that's true for most people. He's not a household name. He actually won a Nobel Prize in economics in 1986. But he wasn't a public intellectual like, say, Milton Friedman. He wasn't a media figure.
He operated behind the scenes.
Very much so. But MacLean sees his fingerprints all over these archives in Virginia. So she decides, okay, I need to figure out who this guy is. She follows the thread to George Mason University, which is where Buchanan spent his later career. They have his archives there in a place called the Buchanan House.
And this is where the story gets a little bit like a movie.
It really does. I mean, you'd expect the archive of a Nobel laureate at a major university to be, pristine, climate-controlled rooms, cataloged boxes, white gloves.
Right, the whole deal.
She gets to this house on the GMU campus, and it's a total mess. It's completely in disarray. She describes finding file cabinets in the bathroom, boxes literally shoved under staircases. Nothing is cataloged. It's all just there. Raw.
Wow, for a historian, that's both a jackpot and a total nightmare.
It's the jackpot. Because it hadn't been curated yet, no one had gone through and sanitized it or organized it to present a certain image. She was looking at the unfiltered, private history of this movement.
And what does she find in those boxes?
She finds the letters, the private correspondence. She starts piecing together these letters between Buchanan and, crucially, with major business figures, most notably the billionaire industrialist Charles Koch.
Okay.
And as she's reading this stuff, she has this dawning realization that she's not looking at abstract academic theories. She's looking at the actual blueprint for a quiet, multi-decade project to fundamentally re-engineer the American government.
It's like finding the architectural drawings for a building and then realizing you're already standing inside it.
That's a very good way to put it. It's a disturbing, but according to her, an accurate analogy.
So to really understand this blueprint, we need to go back to its origins. Let's set the historical scene. We're in the mid-20th century, Virginia specifically. What's happening? What's the climate that gives birth to this way of thinking?
You really have to put yourself in the mindset of a certain kind of person at that time, a conservative, white, wealthy Southerner in the 1950s. And from their perspective, their entire world is being turned upside down.
In what way?
Well, first, you've got the long shadow of the New Deal. For 2 decades, the federal government has been expanding at an incredible rate. It's regulating business, it's empowering labor unions, it's creating Social Security. The state is getting bigger.
So there's this growing federal power in the economic sphere.
Right. And then comes the cultural and political atom bomb. The 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education.
The desegregation of public schools.
Yes. And we're taught to see this, correctly, as a landmark victory for civil rights, a moral reckoning. But for the group that MacLean is studying, this circle of thinkers around James Buchanan at the University of Virginia, this was a signal of something else entirely, something terrifying to them. It wasn't just about race, though. To be clear, race was absolutely the trigger. It was about federal power.
It was about Washington, D.C. telling a state what it could and couldn't do.
Exactly. The federal government was telling a sovereign state how to run its own institutions, what to do with its own, quote-unquote, property. The backlash wasn't just about racial animus. It was a backlash against what they saw as federal coercion.
So the logic is, if a national majority wants something, like desegregation or higher taxes on the wealthy or powerful unions, and they use the federal government to impose that will on a local minority,
In this case, the white Southern elite.
then that to them isn't democracy. It's tyranny.
It is the tyranny of the majority. That's the key phrase. And this leads us right to the book's central thesis. Because normally, when you and I hear the phrase protecting minority rights, we think of protecting vulnerable populations.
We think of the Civil Rights Act, or protecting religious minorities, or LGBTQ rights.
Of course. But this is the crucial linguistic flip that you have to understand to get the book's argument. In the framework developed by Buchanan and this movement, the minority that needs absolute constitutional protection is the wealthy, the capital class, the makers.
And the majority.
The majority is the great unwashed, the mob, the voters who might use their democratic power to demand things like wealth redistribution, environmental regulations, public health care, things that cost the makers money.
So the thesis in plain language is
Yeah.
a network of thinkers, led intellectually by Buchanan and financed by people like Charles Koch, developed and executed a long-term plan to restructure American governance.
To insulate wealth and property from democratic control. The goal wasn't to win elections. The goal was to change the system so that the takers, the majority, could never legally vote to take resources from the makers, the minority. It's about rigging the game itself.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics of that, because it sounds a bit abstract. But the book argues it's based on a very sophisticated, if cynical, economic and legal theory. And it starts with this first core insight, the idea that policy is downstream from architecture.
Yes. This is Buchanan's big light bulb moment. He's at the University of Virginia during the period known as massive resistance.
This was Virginia's response to Brown v. Board.
A furious response. The state government literally threatened to shut down the entire public school system rather than integrate it. It was absolute chaos.
Yeah.
And Buchanan is watching all this political fighting, all this arguing over specific policies. Should we fund this school? Should we pass this law? And he comes to a realization
Which is?
that this is a fool's errand. It's a losing battle.
Why?
Because the math is against you. If the majority of people want something and the rules of the game say the majority rules, then eventually the majority is going to win. You might win a skirmish here or there, but you will lose the war. You can't win the argument if the very structure of the game favors your opponent.
So he pivots. He changes his focus entirely.
Completely.
Yeah.
He shifts from worrying about who rules, which party is in the state house, to changing the rules. He actually goes to the president of UVA at the time, a man named Colgate Darden, and he makes a proposal. He says, we need to create a new center, a new kind of institution to train a new generation of thinkers.
And their goal wouldn't be to get into politics.
No. Their goal would be to fight federal power, not through lobbying or elections, but through ideas, through constitutional theory, by changing the very definition of what government is allowed to do.
Which brings us to the second big insight, which is the primary tool they use to do this: public choice theory. Now, this is what Buchanan won his Nobel for. It's a legitimate field of economics. But the way the book presents its application is profoundly cynical.
It's arguably the most cynical framework for understanding human behavior ever created. To put it in simple terms, public choice theory is just applying the rules of economics to the actions of government.
Okay, what does that mean?
Well, before Buchanan, most political science, and even most economics, operated under what he called the romance of leadership. We basically assumed that, yeah, politicians might be flawed or incompetent, but deep down, their goal was the public good.
Right. We assume a bureaucrat at the EPA is actually trying to protect the environment, even if they're not doing a great job.
Exactly. We assume a public school teacher wants to educate children. Buchanan looked at that and said, that's naive nonsense. He argued that a politician or a bureaucrat is no different from a CEO or a guy selling used cars. They are a rational actor, acting purely in their own self-interest.
So a politician's goal isn't the public good, it's just getting reelected.
Getting reelected, expanding their power, getting a bigger budget for their department, not because it serves the public, but because a bigger budget means more power and prestige for them. There is no public good. There are only millions of self-interested individuals trying to maximize their own personal gain, and some of them just happen to work in government buildings.
If you accept that premise, it changes your perception of everything the government does.
It reframes it completely. So under public choice theory, what is a teachers' union? It's not a group of dedicated educators trying to improve schools and advocate for their profession.
No, they're a special interest group.
They are rent seekers. That's the key term. They are using the coercive power of the state, the government, to extract money or rents from the taxpayers for their own private benefit. They are, in this view, looting the public treasury.
And that term, rent-seeking, gets applied to everyone. Environmental groups, civil rights organizations, AARP.
Anyone who asks the government for anything. They are all portrayed not as citizens petitioning their government for redress of grievances, but as parasitic special interests trying to exploit the makers, the taxpayers. Buchanan's term for it was legalized gangsterism.
Legalized gangsterism. That is an incredibly loaded phrase.
It is, but you have to follow the logic to its conclusion. If democracy is just a system where different gangs, the takers, can vote to legally mug the productive citizens, the makers.
Democracy itself is the problem.
Democracy is the mechanism for the exploitation. It's a threat to liberty and property. And if that's what you believe, then you have a moral obligation to stop it.
To constrain it, to bind its hands.
Exactly. Which brings us to insight number 3. Using constitutional design to insulate power. If you know you can't win the popular vote because your ideas are unpopular, and let's face it, a platform of let's eliminate Social Security and privatize public parks isn't a winning ticket in America, then you have to find another way.
You have to make it impossible for the voters to even have a say on those things.
You take it off the table. And the book gives this really chilling example of this theory being put into practice. But it didn't happen in the United States, not at first. It happened in Chile.
Under the Pinochet dictatorship.
Yes. This is where the abstract theory gets very real very quickly. In the 1970s and 80s, you have this brutal military junta in Chile, which overthrew a democratically elected socialist government. They need to write a new constitution. And who do they invite to come down and advise them?
James Buchanan.
James Buchanan and his colleagues from what became known as the Virginia School of Economics.
Okay, hold on. This is a movement that talks constantly about liberty and freedom, and they're flying to Chile to advise a military dictatorship that tortures and disappears its citizens.
That's the profound contradiction at the heart of the story.
Yeah.
And MacLean argues that from Buchanan's perspective, he wasn't there to endorse the junta's human rights abuses. He saw that as separate. He was there to help them design a constitution that would lock in economic liberty for generations to come.
He called it a constitution of locks and bolts. What does that actually mean in practice?
It means designing the rules of the government so that even when the dictator is gone and democracy returns, the new democratically elected government is powerless to change the free market economic system that the dictatorship installed.
Can you give me a concrete example of one of these locks?
The clearest one is a constitutional balanced budget amendment. Now, that sounds great, right? Very responsible. Don't spend more money than you take in.
Sounds like common sense.
But if you embed that in the Constitution, you effectively make modern macroeconomics illegal. You make it unconstitutional for a government to engage in deficit spending to stimulate a collapsed economy during a recession, which is a core tenet of Keynesian economics.
So if the country's in a depression and the people vote for a government that promises a massive stimulus package,
The Supreme Court of that country would strike it down. Unconstitutional. The will of the people becomes irrelevant. Another lock is the supermajority requirement.
right?
Buchanan advised them to write into their constitution that any major new spending program or regulation would require, say, a 2/3 or even a 3/4 vote in the legislature to pass.
Which means a minority can block anything. It gives them a veto.
An absolute veto. If you need 66% of the vote to do something, a block of 34% can stop it. It effectively freezes the status quo in place. The whole goal was to create what MacLean calls a dead man's switch for free market capitalism. Pinochet could die, his regime could fall, but his economic model would be locked in, constitutionally protected from the voters.
That is incredibly effective.
Yeah.
And deeply anti-democratic. You don't need a dictator if the Constitution itself acts as the dictator.
That is the insight. And MacLean's argument is that this was the model they wanted to import back into the United States, but of course, they had a problem.
You can't just have a military coup in Washington, D.C. and rewrite the Constitution.
No, this is a very old, very stable democracy. You need a different strategy. You need to scale up your operation. And you need to be quiet about it. You need stealth. And this brings us to the fourth major insight, building what they called the counterintelligentsia.
And this is where Charles Koch really becomes a central character.
Right. By the 1970s, Buchanan realizes that just being an academic and writing papers isn't going to change the world. He needs resources. He needs leverage. At the same time, Charles Koch, who is inheriting his father's industrial empire, is coming to the conclusion that just donating to political campaigns is, well, inefficient.
He's an engineer by training.
He's an engineer. He looks at politics like a systems problem, like a supply chain. And he sees a bottleneck in the supply chain of ideas.
That's a fascinating way to put it.
Both Koch and Buchanan realized they couldn't win a head-on battle of persuasion. Their ideas were, frankly, unpopular with a majority of Americans. Most people like Social Security. They like public schools and national parks. They want environmental protection.
So you can't win in the court of public opinion.
So you build an entirely new court. You bypass public opinion altogether. You build an infrastructure, a counterintelligentsia to develop, legitimize, and implement your ideas from the inside out.
So this is more than just lobbying.
So much more. It's a vertically integrated production line for political change. It starts at the top of the funnel. You fund academic centers. They started at UVA, then Virginia Tech, and then the mothership, George Mason University. GMU essentially became their base camp. They created a safe harbor where these economic ideas, which were rejected by the mainstream, could be developed without scrutiny.
But it doesn't stop at the university level.
No, that's just the R&D department. From there, you fund the think tanks, the Cato Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Mercatus Center at GMU. Their job is to take the dense academic theory and turn it into slick policy papers and op-eds.
They translate it for politicians and the media.
Precisely. Then you have the next level, the legal arm. You fund organizations like the Federalist Society and law and economic centers at top law schools to train a generation of lawyers and judges to see the world through this lens.
And then you get them appointed to the courts.
And then you get them appointed to the courts. And for the state level, you create a piece of machinery like ALE, the American Legislative Exchange Council.
This is a huge piece of the puzzle described in the book.
It's the distribution network. ALED is basically a club where corporate lobbyists and conservative state legislators get together. The lobbyists come with pre-written model bills, literally fill-in-the-blank legislation on everything from union busting to environmental deregulation, and the legislators just take them back to their home states and introduce them as their own.
So a law that gets passed in Arizona might be identical to one passed in Florida because it was written by the same corporate lobbyist in a hotel conference room.
That's exactly how it works. It's a franchise model for lawmaking. And keeping it at the state level, keeping it technical and boring, is central to the fifth insight, the absolute necessity of stealth.
There's a quote from Charles Koch on this, isn't there?
Yes, and it's very revealing. He said, "The failure to use our superior technology ensures failure." And he wasn't talking about computers.
What was the technology?
Their superior understanding of the system's leverage points. Knowing that if you make big, sweeping changes in the most boring, obscure parts of government, Almost nobody will notice until it's too late.
This goes back to another public choice idea, right? Rational ignorance.
Exactly. A concept from Buchanan's colleague Gordon Tullock. It's the simple idea that for a normal, busy person, the cost of becoming an expert on, say, administrative rulemaking at the Department of Agriculture is way too high. You have a job, you have kids to feed, you don't have time to read the Federal Register.
So they weaponize your exhaustion. They hide the revolution in the fine print.
They rely on it. Instead of trying to pass a big, loud bill to abolish the EPA, which would cause a massive public backlash, you pass a series of small technical laws that say the EPA is no longer allowed to use certain kinds of scientific data when it makes its rules.
So the EPA still exists, its sign is still on the building, but it's been paralyzed from within.
It's been hamstrung, and the air and water quality decline, but there was no single dramatic moment of conflict for people to rally against. The change was procedural, not public. It was stealthy.
I want to zoom out for a second and just map this system because there are a lot of moving parts. We've got the actors, the intellectuals like Buchanan, the funders like Koch,
The institutions like George Mason University and the think tanks, the legal networks, the state legislators through AEC.
Right, but there's an intellectual lineage here that MacLean traces that I found really, really shocking. She calls the 19th century pro-slavery theorist John C. Calhoun the Marx of the masterclass, and she draws a direct line from him to Buchanan.
This is maybe the most explosive and controversial claim in the book, but it's historically central to her argument. So John C. Calhoun was a senator from South Carolina before the Civil War. He was a brilliant political mind, and he was the nation's most powerful and articulate defender of slavery.
And he had the exact same problem that Buchanan would have a century later.
The exact same problem. The numbers were turning against him. Calhoun looked at the census data. The population of the industrial North was exploding, while the agrarian South was not. He could do the math. He knew that it was only a matter of time before the Northern majority had the votes in Congress to abolish slavery everywhere.
So, like Buchanan, he concluded that simple majority rule, democracy itself, was the enemy of his interests.
It was a mortal threat to his property, in his case, human property. And his solution was a theory he called the concurrent majority.
What was that?
He argued that for any major federal law to pass, it shouldn't just need a majority of the national vote. It should also need the consent of the major interest groups, or concurrent majorities. In essence, he wanted to give the slaveholding South a constitutional veto over any federal law it didn't like.
That sounds exactly like the supermajority rules that Buchanan was pushing in Chile.
It's the identical logic, a mechanism for a minority to block the will of the majority. MacLean's argument is that Buchanan took Calhoun's raw political theory for protecting slave property and updated it for the 20th century to protect capital property. Both men saw a democratic system that threatened their economic order, and both decided the solution was to put constitutional chains on that democracy.
It really just lays bare the fundamental philosophical conflict. If you truly believe that private property rights are the most sacred and supreme human right, then a robust democracy will always look like a threat.
It is a threat, because in that worldview, liberty is redefined to mean one thing: the unfettered right to use your property as you see fit. So if the government taxes my income to pay for your public school or your health care, that's not social responsibility. That is a violation of my liberty. It is state coercion.
They would even compare taxation to a form of slavery.
They do. The slavery of the productive taxpayer to the whims of the non-productive state and its dependents. And if you genuinely believe that, then dismantling the social safety net isn't a cruel act. It's a profound act of liberation.
Okay, let's bring this into the present day, because the book makes a very strong case that this isn't just history, that this infrastructure they built is, well, fully operational right now.
We are living in the world that this project created.
Let's start with something we hear about all the time.
Yeah.
Voter suppression. The book frames this in a very different way than the usual partisan news coverage.
Yeah, we usually hear about voter ID laws or gerrymandering as just, cynical partisan tactics, Republicans trying to get an edge over Democrats. MacLean asks us to look at it through the lens of public choice theory. Think about the Red New Pat project after the 2010 census. This was an incredibly sophisticated, well-funded, data-driven effort to use gerrymandering to give Republicans unassailable control of state legislatures for the next decade.
And it was wildly successful.
It was. But the goal wasn't just to win elections. The goal, once they had that power, was to change the rules of voting itself. Remember Buchanan's private musings that maybe the franchise, the right to vote should be restricted, maybe only people who are net taxpayers should get a say.
Meaning, if you receive any kind of government benefit, your vote doesn't count.
That's the intellectual underpinning. If you're a taker, why should you get to decide how the maker's money is spent? So the wave of voting restrictions we see, closing polling places in minority neighborhoods, strict voter ID laws that disproportionately affect the poor and students, purging voter rolls, it's not just about partisan advantage. It's a structural effort to curate the electorate, to shrink the pool of voters to one that is more favorable to their worldview.
Another modern tactic you see everywhere is preemption. You see it at the local level constantly. A progressive city council votes to raise the local minimum wage.
And then the conservative state legislature passes a law saying no city in the state is allowed to do that.
Exactly.
That is the ALEC model bill in action. It's Cure Calhoun. You shift power to the level of government where the elite has the most influence. It is incredibly difficult and expensive for a corporation to lobby thousands of different city councils across the country. It is much, much easier to capture 50 state legislatures. So you use the state legislature to strip power away from the cities, where Democratic majorities are often more powerful.
The book's case study on the Flint water crisis was just devastating. I have to say, I never connected what happened in Flint to this broader libertarian economic theory.
It's a direct, real-world application of the core principles. The state of Michigan passed a law creating emergency managers. This law allowed the governor to appoint a single, unelected official to take over any city that was deemed to be in a state of financial emergency.
And that manager had total power.
Total power. They superseded the elected mayor and the elected city council. Democracy was literally suspended in that city. And the emergency manager's one and only mandate was to fix the city's finances. It was to save money and cut costs. Full stop.
And that purely financial logic is what led to the decision to stop buying clean water from Detroit and switch to drawing water from the polluted Flint River.
Yes, it was cheaper. And when the people of Flint started complaining that the water was brown and smelled foul, that their children were getting sick, there was no democratic feedback loop. The person in charge wasn't accountable to them. He was accountable to a spreadsheet in the state capitol.
So the economic goal of solvency was placed higher than the democratic goal of public health and safety.
It's the locks and bolts in practice. It was a system designed to remove political interference, which is their term for the will of the people, from what they see as purely economic decisions. And the catastrophic result was a poisoned city.
Then you had the example of Wisconsin in the early 2010s, the fight with Governor Scott Walker over public sector unions.
Act 10, a massive, massive political battle. And again, the book urges us to look past the surface-level explanation, which was all about balancing the state budget.
The systemic goal was bigger.
Much bigger. It was a strategic move to permanently break the organizational and financial feedback loop of the Democratic Party in that state.
Explain that loop.
Public sector unions are one of the biggest sources of funding and organizational muscle, the boots on the ground, for the political left. If you pass a law that cripples their ability to collectively bargain and collect dues, you don't just win a temporary budget fight. You defund and dismantle your opposition's core infrastructure for the long term. It's a strategic move to permanently alter the political balance of power.
And finally, there's a tactic that is so stealthy it affects almost everyone listening, and most of us don't even know it happened. The privatization of justice through forced arbitration.
This is maybe the ultimate stealth tactic. It's buried deep in the fine print of almost every contract you sign now. Your cell phone contract, your credit card agreement, your employment contract.
There's a clause in there that says, if you have a dispute with a company, you can't sue them in a public court.
You waive your right to a jury trial. Instead, you have to go to a private, binding arbitration process. And crucially, you also waive your right to join a class action lawsuit.
And that's the whole ballgame.
That's everything. A class action is the only tool that allows lots of little people who have been wronged in a small way to band together and become one big person with enough power to take on a massive corporation. If a bank illegally charges 1 million customers a $10 fee, no single person is going to hire a lawyer to sue for $10.
But together, they can sue for $10 million.
Forced arbitration makes that illegal. It atomizes the public. It forces you to fight a billion-dollar corporation all by yourself in a private system often run by arbitrators paid by the corporations. It is a quiet procedural coup against the public legal system.
This all connects so directly to the core themes of this channel, to crisis and perception. We spend so much time in our politics focused on individual blame. We blame a specific politician, Trump or Biden or whoever, for a specific bad outcome.
We focus on the personalities, the daily outrage, the tweets. And MacLean's book is an urgent plea to look past that political theater. She's asking us to see these figures not as masterminds, but as actors performing on a stage that was designed decades ago by people like Buchanan and paid for by people like Koch. The system is designed to produce these outcomes, almost regardless of who the particular front man is.
And it creates a profound crisis in how we perceive reality, because the language itself has been captured.
The narrative warfare has been brilliant, you have to admit. I mean, who is going to say they're against liberty or freedom? But they successfully redefine liberty to mean only one thing: the freedom to use your property without interference.
And freedom becomes freedom from government coercion, from taxes and regulation.
Right. It completely erases other kinds of freedom, like Franklin Roosevelt's freedom from want or freedom from corporate domination. It's this almost Orwellian inversion. They claim to be Madisonian, lovers of the Constitution, while actively working to dismantle the system of checks and balances that Madison designed to mediate between factions. Their system is designed to ensure that one faction, the capital faction, always wins.
And it's so hard to fight back against.
Because it's so boring. It's designed to be boring. It relies on that rational ignorance. It relies on the fact that you are too busy and too tired to go to the municipal zoning board meeting where a key rule is being changed. The system is built to win through attrition.
So as we start to pull this all together, it forces a huge shift in perspective. We tend to think of democracy as a thing we have. It's a static object.
Like a rock or a piece of furniture in the room. But what this book shows is that democracy isn't a state of being. It's a dynamic system. It's just a set of rules. And those rules can be engineered. You can have rules that facilitate majority will, or you can have rules that are intentionally designed to structurally repress it. MacLean's argument is that we have been living through a quiet 60-year engineering project to accomplish the latter.
The patience of it is just staggering. They were thinking in terms of 30, 40, even 60-year timelines.
Absolutely. While much of the left was focused on winning the next 2-year or 4-year election cycle, this movement was building institutions. They were building the counterintelligentsia. They were planting the seeds for trees whose fruit they knew they might not see for decades. And now we're living in the shade of those trees.
MacLean concludes the book with a really provocative question. She asks if what she's uncovered amounts to a fifth-column assault on American democracy.
It's a really heavy term. A fifth column refers to a group working from within to undermine a country or a society. She's asking, is this a stealth attack from inside the gates? If the rules of the game have been so successfully altered that the will of the majority is consistently rendered irrelevant, are we still living in a democracy?
Or have we transitioned to something else? A kind of modern corporate oligarchy that just keeps the outward costume of democracy.
Exactly. The voting booths are still there. The politicians still give speeches. The flags still wave. But if the outcomes are largely predetermined by the locks and bolts baked into the system, by gerrymandered districts, by a captured judiciary, by constitutional constraints on government action, how meaningful is the act of voting?
That is the really haunting question the book leaves you with.
It recontextualizes the entire political debate. It forces you to ask a fundamental question. Are we participating as citizens in a shared democratic project, or are we just residents in a vast economy that was designed by and for someone else?
And if it's the latter, how do we become citizens again? That's the challenge that just hangs in the air after you finish reading.
A deeply unsettling but absolutely necessary question to ask.
We've been discussing democracy in chains, the deep history of the radical right's stealth plan for America by Nancy MacLean. I can't recommend enough that you read or borrow the source material for yourself. The sheer weight of historical evidence she brings to bear is something you really have to see firsthand.
I agree. It's a dense and challenging read, but it is absolutely essential for understanding the deep mechanics of our current political moment.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer link in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.
Until next time.